Okay, it's live. Good morning. So, we're in the middle of the Maamar, the 8th Maamar of the Hemshech. Maamar of Bolok, Mimona. So I'll try to review today both this Maamar and the next, Bolok, and Pinchas. So, just a little context. What we discussed last week was the Rebbe Rashab is B'chlolos right now going into the sugya of, is the middle of the sugya, I should say, of Er Pnimi. What exactly, when you dissect the anatomy of how the Ibishter devised a system that Elokus should be mislabish in Elamus. So that, of course, even though we use these words all the time, but that's not a small achievement. Because it's one thing that Elokus remains l'mayla ma'elamus. It says, Huma keme shalelam ve'ena elam keme. That what we call sevav kalam, or higher even. But when you speak about mamala kalam or er pnimi, so now the question is exactly how does it work? So after explaining by Riches, the shadish, the original root of er pnimi, which is in the Esses Firas Agnuzas Lifnat Simtsum, basically shir atzmi b'keach, the Eibishter envisioned what he wants, like al derech moshel, an architect envisioning the binyan, the structure he wants. Then comes a tzimtzum. In order to implement it, you have to conceal that eir habligvul. And what emerges is a kav, and now the tzimtzum has caused space for the structure to be able to be built. But what we're moving now further is how do you build the structure? How does he build the structure? So with B'derech Klal, everyone knows, B'asara Maimoris Nivra Elam. Eibishter used 10 Maimoris, 10 statements. Bereshis Bara Elikim, is Nami Maimerhu, and there's Yehi Eir, Yehi Rekia, Teitzi Eretz Desha, etc. But that's just a statement. How does it work exactly? So the Rebbe Rashab is now explaining exactly the process of how Er Pnimi becomes an Er Pnimi. In other words, it remains a Lukus because it's Er, and there's Me'ena Moed. But it's an Lukus that's being shaped and tailored to fit, ultimately, Kalim, which means to fit the structure of existence. So, to put it in simple terms, if the Maamar Yehi Er would not be measured exactly to create Er, we wouldn't have Eir. So it has to have a perfect structure that fits, just like Keach Hariyah, like the Moshli gave in the beginning of the Hemshech, the power to see. If the Keach Hariyah of the Nefesh did not fit perfectly in the eye, it'd either be too overwhelming. That's why we have the Lashon Sagi Nohar. So Chassidus explains, what is that? When you call a blind person a Sagi Nohar, it sounds like you're making litzonos of him. Because Saginar means a lot of light, a ribui eir. So we know it's the opposite. He's blind. He has no eir. So Chassidus says no. It's taka has sagi eir, but the kalim, the filters are not working. So b'meil the eir is essentially it's like imagine electricity surging into a light bulb. It will burst the whole light bulb. So eir pnimi has to be measured exactly to fit. Just to use another example, which is just to make it a little more tangible. Like for example, the dam, the blood, dam ha'nefesh. So the blood to flow in a human being, we know it has to be a perfect measure. If the blood is too thick or too thin, it can create problems. If it's too thin, it can create a hemorrhage. If it's too thick, it can create a block, a clot. So it has to be perfect. It's a perfect example of the blood has to fit exactly the channels, the so-called the veins, the arteries, etc. So now we're in the middle of that discussion. So B'chol, as the Rebbe Rashab said in this Maamar Bolok, that there's 3 levels. How Er Pnimi becomes an Er Pnimi, there's 3 levels. First, it's how it's kolol b'sharshei in the Esses Firas Agnuzas. That's level 1. We talked about that last week at length. That he calls Hamelech Hamerumim Levade, Ma'oz. Then you have how the Er is no longer just kolol. It's already emerged, so to speak. So it's called, the second level he called his galus eris misharsham. So there you have already, but still Esesphere is Bli Ma, that's a Misnasi Mias Elam. And level 3 is when the Eidos are ready to go into the Kalim. That's level 3. And he explained, to explain it better, he said, this is the difference between Nakuda, Kav, and Shetach. And I elaborated on that also last week. Then Nakud, everything starts with a point. It then spreads Eirich. First it extends in length, and then it extends in width. Now, Kemuvan is always important to mention. The Eibishter's Kol Yachal could do anything he wants. He didn't have to do anything like this at all. He could have said, Bereshis Bara, I want to have a Welt, and poof, and you have a world. The problem with that would be that it would not be a world that we would understand, the Seichel, the way the Eibishter created it. And problem number 2 would be that we have no way of connecting to it, because it's Eibishter's Kol Yachal. He can do whatever he wants, but how do you and I, Lamata Lamaila, climb the ladder, so to speak, and have any form of relationship with Eibishter, if he's just invoking, so to speak, the Kol Yachal part? So the Eibishter, the same Kol Yachal, wanted Africa to be malbishit in a structure, in a seichel-dika way, as much as possible. Kemuvan, there's always going to be like areas where you have to rely on keich hamafilasis, or that only bekeich shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu to create yesh ma'ayin. No one can create yesh ma'ayin. That's only becheik abeda. But that gufa the Eibishter did in a way that we can make sense as much as possible. So that's just saying that I always, every few mamorim, it's kedai to remember that, because it's important to remember the whole thing is for us, really. It's for Avedis Hashem. Okay, so Nekuda Kav Shetach. Nekuda Kav Shetach. So we discussed the Nekuda was the point, and that then is Nisarech, it goes into Eirich. So it's like level 2. You don't yet have a Kav alone, you don't have a structure. You have Amshacha, but you don't have a Eirich and Rechiv. And then comes the Hey, the Shetach. Okay. Oh, but before we got to Shetach, okay, we stopped here. So I want to just go over, so in the Kav itself, the Rebbe Rashab explains two Eifan. I'm looking now in the beginning of Perek Lamed Aleph, in the Maimer of Bolok. It's the next to the last two Prokim. I'm going to go over now. She says, so Bechlal is an in of Eirich, which is Gilui, but not Ispashtus. So it says, Omnim yesh b'zeh beizeh fan. So let me review the two Efanim, how he explains Kav. Aleph ku ma sheprat echad bo b'amshoch v'zgalas madrega l'madrega. Komei b'ashpos ha'seichel megodel l'kotten. So what's the story? A teacher, let's say, says, I'm going to explain now an inyan. And he starts with a Nekuda. The Nekuda, let's say, even this inyan, Nekuda Kav Shechetef. He wants to explain that. So he starts with a Nekuda. And this Nekuda now, he starts developing. So the same Nekuda, he says, Prach Echot, he's not going into more pratim. Taking one prat of the Seichel, and that is being mamshich in a way that we can, I'll read it inside. She'isa inyan pratim, shemashpiyalei, mislabish b'moshel, or be'eze inyan shehu be'erech ha'makabel. So you take one inyan, and you're explaining it with an example, or in any way that you're explaining that one inyan. You're not going into more pratim of the inyan. So Eidach really means you're carrying one akuda, you're carrying it to its farthest conclusion, so to speak, as much as you're possible, so the Makabel should understand. Okay, so you can take this Nekuda, like I just said, Nekuda Kaf Shetach. You can explain it to anybody. You can explain it on a mathematical level. You can explain it. You're taking one Nekuda. You're not going into any pratim. You're taking one prat and explaining it as best as you can, even to a child, even the Baal Seichel Kot. That's one Eifim. So then, what is the Kav? The Kav is Sachakol Hamshacha of the Nekuda. The Nekuda is the point that begins. The Kav extended it Lamata Mata. Eifin Abeis, says the Rebbe Rashab, Hushakav Hurak is Galus HaProtim, Sheba Nekuda. Loi Havos HaPrat Idei HaSoga V'Avona. Kimrak Havos is Galus HaProtim Sheba Nekuda. Okay, so this, you're not explaining the Nekuda per se. What he's doing is the Nekuda has a bunch of Protim in it. and you are just being megala those pratim. I'll explain in a minute what difference. Why is the Rebbe Rashab Negei here to Eifanim? But let me just read it inside before I do that. The Mamela Gama pratim and B'chinas Pshitis u'B'chinas Hiyulis Adayin. So in the first mile of the first way is the prat is not remaining just as a b'cholos. You break it down into a moshel with another moshel and you explain the prat. In the second eifin, he says the kav, the amshacha, is not taking a prat and developing it. It's just revealing the pratim that are already there. So really, the kav is really still a eifin hiyuli. In the first eifin, at least you got some havana in one prat taka, because it's only one prat, one kav. But at least there's some type of understanding with a moshel. And here, there's no moshel at all. All the kav is doing is taking the pratim that were in the hiyuli of the nekuda, and it's bringing it out begoli. But he says it still remains in the eifin of hiyuli in pshittis. And the Rebbe Rashab gives an example because this is a little abstract. He says, "Val derech hamishna sheminyonim pratim sheinu b'chinas hasoga adayin. Atzim izbayim achkach begemora beribus svaras v'hasoga sheinis. Rak shezer is galus hapratim shebenekuda dayin shebetera shebiksav." Okay, so this is a very fascinating example. It's bekitzed here in other places. Later in Ayin Beis, the Rebbe Rashab will use this parichas. But what's the difference? Pashat, break it down. We know with this Teresh B'Ksav, Pasuk. We know how the Amr Kra. Then you have Mishnah, which is Teresh Shabbat Ped, but it's Lashon Kotzer. A Mishnah is very concentrated, just a few lines. And then you have Gemara. So in the context of Nekuda Kav Shetach, how does this work? So the Pasuk is like a Nekuda. Because Psukim, you can't derive halacha from it. You don't know pratim. Even if the pasuk is usually going to be unclear, what does that mean? As we know. So you need the Mishnah to at least explain it. So he compares the Mishnah to Kav, but to the second eifin of the Kav. Because the Mishnah takes the Lashon, but he says the Mishnah takes the pasuk, the Nekuda, and gives it some type of, he says, Shem Anyonim Pratim, Shem B'chinas Hasoga, right. So the Mishnah at least breaks it down. And we'll give some pratim in that nekuda, but you don't yet have shetach. You don't yet have an arichas hasbara until you get to the Gemara. So in this context, Teresh B'Ksav is the nekuda, the kav is the Mishnah, and Gemara is the shetach. One second. Let me just say 1 second. So this is clearly like the eifin habeis, because the eifin ha'alef, the kav is explaining one prat. That's not the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't take one prat of the pasuk and explains it. The Mishnah takes the inyan and gives a whole bunch of details, and the Gemara then unpacks it into prati. Ma'amarta?
אמרנו שנקודת כף שטח זה כמו תורש בכסף, משנה גמר. שומע, בהתחלה אומר, המלך אמרים לנו לא זה, שזה, היינו בכלל סמוקר עדיין, בכלל לא בכלל. אז תראו שבכסף הוא לא מקר עדיין, זה אומר שהרבה אנשים, זאת אומרת, כשאתה פותח לפעמים תאיר, אתה רואה שזה כן מקר, זה לא כמו קו של נקודה שבאמת, הוא לא מקור בכלל,
הבנתי.
זה נעשה עצמי, שאין כן תאיר שבכסף, לפעמים אתה יכול לראות בפנים, מה לא חלק, על יוחד, כמובן צריך להיזהר.
I'll repeat in English, okay? So he's asking a question. He said this, if you compare it to what said before, we're talking about Estes Firis Agnuzis Lifnei Tzimtzum. So B'chal doesn't have, it's not even considered a mocker. So how do you, now we're saying it's Teresh B'Ksav is l'chol ha'pachas ha'mocker. So first of all, my answer would have two answers for that. Number one is that Estes Firis Agnuzis B'ferish is yet called a mocker. It's called Shor She'eris. It's not like Eid HaBlikvul. Secondly, Lav Dafka, when he's explaining here, is to be Lav Dafka the highest levels. The third thing I want to say is that Teresh B'Ksav depends how you look at Teresh B'Ksav. If you look at Teresh B'Ksav as Pi Hashem Diber, you can say B'Ferish is the highest level. The Teresh B'Ksav is not really Shaykh to Havana, even though you can learn Pshut to Shamikra. So I would say with a combination of all three. I'm not going to say Teresh. Can you say Teresh B'Ksav is Esses Firis Agnuzis? Lav Dafka, first of all, could be even higher. But Al Derech, it's Al Derech. So I wouldn't, yeah. Okay. But it's a good example because you have now a Nekuda Kaf Shel. So the Eibishter basically, the Torah reflects, Astacha Baraisa Bar Alma, The same way the Torah has these dargis. Now, when the Eibishter just give us Gemara, what do we need a pasuk? What do you need a Mishnah? We start with Gemara, and then the Gemara is based on the Eibishter's Ratzon Elyon. Because that Gufa, the Eibishter wanted Torah to be structured, where you start with a Nekuda, you develop the Nekuda into a Kav, and then into a Shetach. So the same things, the elements are also created like that. Now, why did he bring Eifana Aleph as the Shaila? So I remember when I learned it the first time, it wasn't clear. I don't know if I have it clear either now, to be honest. The only thing I could say is that maybe be negated to later in the Achdus Hadvarim, because Pashtus, remember, it's not just the Gashmis, the Inyan of Nekuda Kav Shechta, it's how you understand what's the mile of a Nekuda over Kav and Shetach. The mile of the Nekuda is that it reflects most the Elikus. That's why it's not Shach the Protim. So it's like the mile of Eir, that's Megala HaMoir, but it's not like Shefa, L'Fierach HaMekablim. The mile of Shetach, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's Mislabish Mamish and relates to us. So in the Mamutza, between Elikus and Velt, you need all three levels. You need, the Nekuda is like more or less like the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, as it explains elsewhere. The Shetach is like the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra, and the Kav is something in between. So in other words, you want to have something that reflects us. When you learn Teresh B'Ksav, for example, later he's going to explain, what's made there is Elikus, not so much Havana Vasoga. When you learn Gemara, it's the exact opposite. The Elikus is more Behelim, and the Havana Vasoga is the Ikar. And both are necessary, because the Eibishter wants us to understand Torah, not just to learn Torah. So in Teresh B'Ksav is Meir the Kedusha. That's why a Chumash or a Sefer Torah is holier, so to speak. You know, like, for example, if someone brings in a Sefer into a room, you don't stand up. Sefer Torah, you stand up. Because Sefer Torah is Kedusha B'Goli, it's a Lekuz B'Goli. Anyway, B'Kitzur, the point is, so it could be that's why he brings Eifana Aleph, because Eifana Aleph tells us that even the Kav already has Protim that you can relate to. So it makes the Achdus with the Nivroim stronger. And Eifana Beis, the Protim are still, like in the Mishnah, they're not yet clear. So it could be that's why it brings Eifana Aleph, because the Achdus Advarim, it could be that it has a mile in that sense, that the Kav, and we're going to learn about the Kav a lot, the Kav Chut, that is really has Protim in it, or doesn't have Protim in it. That's the difference in the two Eifanim. Now, Rashab, I don't think he spells it out here. Maybe he does afterwards. I mean, I stand correct. If he does spell it out, then we don't need to guess. I don't think so. Okay, but Bekitzer, to continue, B'ina Kav shemechiber nekudas harben nasa Kav, v'hu shemadreges protish sheboy hem b'chinas nekudas or b'chinas pshitis. So essentially, Mishnah is the perfect mamutza. Because on one hand, Mishnah does have more protim. You can't say it's like a pasuk. On the other hand, it's still made from Klali. From the Mishnah alone, you can't derive any halachas. And that's why you need the Gemara. So in Teira Gufa, we have these three things. Okay. In the parentheses, I just want to go over this. In the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab says that this difference between Akudim and Nukudim, because we haven't gotten to Shetach yet. So here, the Nakudim and Nakudim is also like Nakuda and Kav. Akudim is Esek Sarim Shein Eres Atzmim B'chin Bilti Mitzias. So it's all like in a Nakuda. When Nakuda Shabab is Galas K'mashem B'pshitosim B'atzmiyusam. Dugmekazei Su Inyan HaKav. Yeah. Okay, now, before he goes to Shetach, one more thing he wants to say. Like we learned earlier, so the Kav is already a diminished state, the Nukuda. Like the Mishnah is lower than Fierach, the Teresh B'Ksav. Nevertheless, he says, that's the key. Still pshitis, l'fi erech, it's still pshitis. So I want to give an example for this. Let me just read for Lima, Lagabe Eres HaMislashim B'Kel. Okay. You know that in the Keches HaNefesh, we also, Chassidus talks about the Keches Gluyim. Keches Gluyim is the faculties of a person that you are very obvious. You know, I'm using my hands right now. That's okay, Goli. Use your seichel. You use your eyes, you use your ears. These are basically revealed faculties there. But what happens, let's say, when you're asleep? So we know your faculties don't disappear. They're just not pale. They go into a state of keach. So Chassidus calls that keches nelamim. So it's a keich nelam. It would be like if my hand was just sitting on the table, not doing anything. So the keich, let's say to write or to move, keich hatanua, is behelam. But it just doesn't take much for me to just pick up my hand and use it. So the helam is not a helam she'ena b'mitzias or a helam that's a ba'efen hiyuli. It's not pshittis. It's just concealed. Okay, so then we go further. Remember, the nefesh doesn't have any protim in it. So how does the keich goli comes from the keich nelam? Where's the keich nelam come from? So the next step, Chassidus says, is the keich is hiyulim. I'll spell them all out. The keich is hiyulim. Then Chassidus talks about keich is atzmim. And then it talks about keches haklulim b'nefesh, and the final level is nefesh neisa keches. And higher than that is the nefesh itself. That's my nefesh. So how many steps did I just say? 6, 7 steps, right? That's my nefesh. Nefesh neisa keches, klulim b'nefesh, atzmim, hiyulim, nalomim, gluim. 7 levels. Not always the Chassidus who talks all 7. Sometimes it just talks 3, like he's doing here more or less. But if you really break it down, now what's the inyan in this? Because it's explaining al pi seichel how a nefesh, which is pashut, if you were able to look at a nefesh, if you were able to, you wouldn't see keches hanging around there. The keches are not visible. And yet we know that the keches come from the nefesh because God forbid, after Me'av Esrim Shana, a body doesn't have keches. It has kelim, it has fingers, but it doesn't have any vitality or any keich. So the keches have to come from the nefesh, and yet the nefesh is poshut. So how does from pshittis come to tzir, which is essentially what we learned a lot about l'mayla. Is a baby here? Huh? Kale yelled becha. Okay. The Kale has a babysitting service. Oh. Why not? Al kaponim, I'm just trying to make it a little more tangible so you can relate to this. So the point is, again, what I said at the beginning, the Eibishter wanted us to have a capacity. How does a noshim kerkenu? We're human beings. We relate to tangible things. You know, I meet people all the time. They tell me, I don't understand all this ruchnius maisis. I only relate to things I can count, like money. You know, that was basically what he said. So how do you explain to a regular materialistic person? How do you start explaining inyanim that are not tangible? First of all, the nefesh is not tangible. You can't touch it. And even higher than that, you start talking about a lakus. So fine, even when we're talking here, a lakus that's mislabish b'nivraim. But it's still, if yerech the nivra, it's still a dover poshet. So what the Eibishter did was create a seder shtalshlus and created a human being, b'tzelem elikim, b'psari echzel lekah. Our keches nefesh, like the Alter Rebbe establishes right in the beginning, Perek Gimel and Tanya, ishtalshlu mehen. You know, we read it many times, but you have to appreciate it. He's saying that the keches of the human being and ishtalshlu from the esesfiris. So the keches connected esesfiris. What's the point? The point is, because that's the whole chiddush, one of the chiddushim of Chassidus Chabad, mepsari echzelekah. You can look at mepsari, at your flesh, at your very body, and at the nature of existence. And from that, understand the lakus. Because the world was created, b'dugma kegavna, like we say, but even more protest, nishtal shalmam, tzelem elikim, that the human beings created b'tzalmenu kidmusenu. And therefore, from mipsari, you understand. So to be able to come from a darga where you're a complete mitzuyah, and everything is defined by structures, to come to understand the lakusha b'zeh. So these are the steps. B'chlolis, it's shetach, kav, nekuda. But protis is the 7 levels I just explained. So I'm not going to go into all of them. But b'chlolis, it's the nekuda is that you want to go from a keyach mitzuyir mamish to less seer and less seer and less seer till you get to a state of pshittis. So that's why he's so adamant in emphasizing here that the kav is mamish in between. If the Nakuda is a Nakuda Pshuta, like we discussed last week, a Nakuda is not Tefes Mokim. And a Shetach is already completely Tefes Mokim, because it's Eirech and Rechev, the Kav is right in between. Like he says, the Kav on one hand is Poshet, On the other hand, already his Amshacha. Let me just read the Asis here because he says it very clear. He says like this. So even though a kav is a miut legaba nekuda, pshitas adayin b'chinas bli mal legaba eres hamislapshim b'kelim. Okay. So in a way, if you want to go back to the Gemara, the Teresh B'Ksav Mishnah and Gemara Moshel, Dugma, then the Mishnah is exactly in between. The Mishnah is already it's more lefi erech the Makablim, but it still retains pshittus in it, and that's a critical level. And from there you go to Gemara, and Gemara is already the Riches HaProtim and the whole Shakvataria and Kashas and Terutzim and arguments and counter arguments. Okay, so now comes the third level, Vashetach. Vashetach hu kamei she'eres mislapshim b'kelim. Shenas b'chinas era chochma v'era chesed k'fi muchus ha'kelim. So now we're talking about the eres and mamish manifesting in the containers and the kelim. Ve'enam b'chinas pshitus kamei eres b'tzad atzmo. Ad shapel misav is the biyak k'fi efen ha'kelim. So now they're not pshitus like it was the the kav on its own. And the kav here also includes the kav chut that comes after the tzimtzum. So bottom line is, so now you have the three levels. The kav shetach. V'adugma b'zeh, says the Rabbi Rashab, yesh lemer, k'moy ba'atzilus, ruchi shal meisha al askenim. Okay, so now he's going to explain this piece about the ruchi. The word atzilus, we first mentioned atzilus in Torah, is in Pasha Ba'alescha, Vatzalti min haruach. The Eibishter says, I will impart or emanate from your spirit. She was saying, Ayin Beis Maamar, or Pasha with the Skenim. So if you think about it, it's an interesting story. If you don't know the Chassidus, there's only one Rebbe, there's one Moshe, and he's supposed to be Mamshech all the Hamshachas. And suddenly the Eibishter is saying, no, Vatzalti min haruach, I'm going to take from your ruach of Moshe, I'm going to put it on the Skenim. So are the Skenim in Dargas Mesha, or are they in the Darga of Bnei Yisrael? So clearly there's shtikl mamutza here. And from there comes the concept of Atzilus. So when Kabbalah starts using Atzilus, the Protis, it's exactly the same thing. They use the word Hafrosha, Atzilus from the word Hatzola, to in English impart or emanate, the two words that you can use to translate it. So how is it different than Bria? Bria is a creation. The Eibishter didn't say, V'borosi min haruach. He said Vatzalti, meaning that on one hand it's still the ruach of Moshe, on the other hand it's now been transferred to a lower level. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying now that this is a dugma for the last level that we just spoke about, which is the Eres and Keim Shetach. So I'll just read it inside. It's a very sadistic piece. So he says, "Dugma b'zeh yesh lemer." So this is the Rebbe Rashab's chiddush. Kamei ba'atzilus ruchi shal meisha al askenim harei shenoch al askenim hoyochel liyas hashpos haboser mashalo ye'efshel liyas meruchi shal meisha atzmei shelo yaldei askenim. So what's the chiddush here? Moshe says, "Ma'ayin li basar." I'm a teacher. I'm the Aish Alikim. I don't know, it's not the words he would use, but I'm saying his union was Moshe Kibbutz Torah Mesinim Masara. He's teaching Torah. Why are you coming to me for basar? The Rebbe compares it sometimes how the Alter Rebbe initially, when they came and asked Gashmis the things from the Alter Rebbe, says, "What do you ask me for Gashmis? My union is to be Mashpia Ruchnis." And later the Alter Rebbe changed his position. And there's also Mamshel Gashmis. It's negated to this directly. So Moshe is saying, "Ma'ayin li basar." So the Eibishter says, the Eibishter doesn't tell him like Betzalel, for example, by the Mishkan, you know what? Delegate it, and someone else will be Mamshel basar to them. No, because all the Amshachas have to come from Moshe. But the problem is Moshe is too ruchni, too much of a ruchni. So the Eibishter is Mechadish, I'm going to create a mamutza. It's going to have the ruach of Moshe. At the same time, it's going to be able to relate to the Bnei Yisrael and give them basar. So essentially, Atzilus is a perfect interface, mamutza, between the ruchnistic dargas that are higher than Tziyur, which is like Nukuda, and Nukuda and Kav, and Shetach, it becomes the place, Atzilus becomes the mocker for Biyah. That's what he says here. V'zeu shechos v'salti min haruach asher alecha v'samti aleim sheyesh b'zeh beis dvarim Atzilus ruach shel Mesha u'mashanoch al azkenim. So this very spirit, this ruach, has two things. It's still ruach shel Mesha, but now it's so-called been transferred to the zkenim. V'hainu the Atzilus ruach shel Mesha levad hagam shezeu yerida mimadregosei, because Atzilus is also lower than the Kuda and Kav in higher levels. But nevertheless, lo yoyev shelias adayin hashpos habasa. Ki'im al yidei shenochal askenim shehoyu be'in harech legabe Mesha, ayidei zen nasa ruach shel Mesha be'efek hazeh she'yir v'ayodei hashpos habasa. So besides giving pshat, of course, in the psukim in Balescha, it also is a tremendous havana b'chlal how they able to create a seder shtalshus. Now, the question you could ask is, what was the Alter Rebbe's havamine bazeh? He knew this pasuk, and he knew that. So that's a good shaila. If I bring about it, why did the Alter Rebbe not say? He knows Anosi, and he knows that they're coming to him because he's like they came to Mesha for basar. So why was the Alter Rebbe sheil chatchila the gashmis, and then he changed his position?
Could be to show them that they can look,
It could be to show them that the ikr is ruchnis, and it was like basically like saying what do you licht in basar, you licht in gashmis, which is the same way that it could say it's exactly what Mesha did. Mesha didn't say let's go to the skating. He said my only basar. He's telling them, what are you coming to me for basar? Basically saying you're lichting in gashmis, we're here for ruchnis. But b'poel mamish, you need to have also the gashmis, so that also comes through.
Well, it depends what they were asking from the Alter Rebbe. If they were asking for basar, fine. But if they were asking shilas of doctors or things like that, can't answer. Just say.
I think in the story they were asking for brachas for us for parnasa. I think, if I recall, maybe I'm wrong. I don't remember. I have to look it up. The Rebbe speaks about it. There's sichos where the Rebbe explains the whole story, what the havamina was, what the maskana was. But regardless, at the end of the day, there's definitely an element that you still need to be looking. It's like there are times you're not supposed to be ligging in basar all day. On the other hand, the fact is we do live in this world. But the point is that it really explains Atzilus well. So Atzilus is shetach. And even shetach is a mamutza. The kav is a mamutza between the kuda and shetach. The kav, the eris before they come into kelim. But the eris bekelim is the mamutza between ruchnis and gashmis, basically. Or if you wish, between the Ein Sof Kedim Atzilus and Biyah, which is already Bria and Yitzira and Asiya. Okay. Ukanedi says clearly the Kol Hashpos HaYitzarech Le'Yisal De Mesha Dafke. Of course, that's the key, because if it doesn't have to be through Mesha, like for example, Yisrael's Eitzah to Mesha was, you have a Sari Arofim, Sari Meis. That's not the same thing here. There, Mesha trained them, and they answered the questions. It wasn't like Ruach Shel Mesha. So it was Bekeich Shel Mesha, but it doesn't say there it was at level of Atzilus. Mashenkin here, you're talking about actual hashpos. Actually, even in Pasha Yisrei, the question is asked, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have common sense. He needed Yisrei to tell him to delegate. I mean, it's a dover pasha. You have thousands of people coming to you. You can't answer all the questions. So Moshe should have established it. So the answer given, remember where, Chassidus for sure, maybe even in Meforshim, on the Pasuk, the answer given is because Moshe knew that he's the person the Eibishter chose to give the Torah. And that's why they're coming to Moshe. So if he would delegate, it would lose, so to speak, Keicha Shel Moshe. So Yisrael's Kiddush was coming from a chutz, that no, you can train them and you can teach them to teach Teres Moshe even and through them. But it's still not the level of Atzilus. That would be the difference between the Skenim and the Sori Alofim. Okay. So suppose I did Moshe down. U'kamoy keinu b'in Atzilus, the Eres Kameshen Atzoluv and Izgalu Meshorshim u'mekeinu me'eses Firis Hagnuzis Hariyim B'chinas Bli Ma Adayin. There we go. So even when the Eres are in Kelim, they still retain a certain element of Bli Ma. No, my mistake. No, I didn't translate right. It says Es Firis Hagnuzis are Bli Ma Adayin. Umemela einam be'erach adayin liz b'chinas smoka l'biyah. V'ayideshen eslapshu b'kelim. Correction. Ayidezen nitvasu b'chinas mitzias liz b'chinas smoka l'biyah. Di'iu v'gamu echad livrei. Yeah, livrei yesh ma'ayin. Good. So with that concludes chapter Perek Lamed Aleph, chapter 31. Now, Anybody want to comment to ask any questions? Fine. As you're going to see as we continue learning Ayin Beis, and remember, Ayin Beis is not a maamar of 10 pages. It's thousands of pages. I think it's a total of 1,500 pages to be exact, something like that, maybe even more. So one of the unique things in Ayin Beis is that Rebbe Rashab does not have to exercise koyach hatzimtzum, which means in a maamar that's 10 pages, 15 pages, there's a beginning and an end. Here, Rebbe Rashab can talk about a sugya for hundreds of pages, literally. And why am I saying it? Because you have to keep in mind that he sometimes comes back to something a lot later and finishing the whole subject matter. I'm not saying it because this is all part of the discussion that he's building up to explain, as I said, Pnimi. So with that, he goes now to the next Pedic. And the next Pedic, let's just go over Bikitsa. What's the next Pedic? The next Pedic is about Omnom. Zeu shehi bislapshusim ba'kelim nitfusu b'chinas mitzias li b'chinas eira chachma ein ze machmas ha'kelim levad. Okay, because here goes back to the dilemma that he keeps going back and forth. Remember, I pointed out there's a constant dance here, because as soon as you start speaking about a mamutza between a lakus and Welt and mitzias, you can't just simply say that you have it figured out, because you always want to retain that it's still a lakus. On the other hand, you want it to be also the fiyarach hanevroim. When we say Nesava Kodesh Baruch Liyas they did it, his Baruch did it b'tachtenim. You want tachtenim. Tachtenim have to be intact. You can't destroy the tachtenim, or else hepech hakavana. It has to be l'shavas yitzar. On the other hand, you want it to be a direlei his Baruch, so it has to retain a lekusin. And this is a complicated matter. To put it in Aveda cases, it's very difficult to live in this world and at the same time be completely dovik telekus. The famous Chassidus talks about why the Ovis chose to be Reyei Tzein. Why were they Reyei Tzein, shepherds? Because that was very conducive for them to be able to go into the fields where the whole hoo-ha of Elam Haza is not really there. The sheep are grazing and they're very docile, they're very peaceful. And they could be mizbeinen and daven and Avedis Hashem and dvekus and all that. Yosef was also the Chatchila Reyet Sein. However, then he was forced by his brothers. They sold him into slavery. And what happens? He ends up becoming the first Jewish accountant. Yeah, Cheshve Cheshbenis of Petifer. And then he becomes the second in command in Mitzrayim, Mishnah Lamelech. And what is he doing all the time? He's busy with the grain, the grain industry. He was overseeing it. He wasn't just giving instructions. So Chassidus says that Yosef was higher than the Ovis. Why? Because the Ovis were able to be connected to the Eibishter by separating through a stickle like being prushim, so to speak. They separated themselves from Elam Haza. And Yosef was in Elam Haza and Erves HaOretz, and still he retained his connection that when they finally reconcile, he sends back a message to Yaakov through the Agolis to remind him that he still remembers the sugi of Egla Rufa that they learned. That even when he was in Biyah, not just in Atzilus, he retained that connection. So what's the Vort? So Chassidus explains, it brings from the Seder Hayem, it's a Sefer. Halacha. Seder Hayem says, why is the Elam Yehei Adam Zoyer b'tfilas hamincha? Ki en Elyo leinena ela b'tfilas hamincha. Elyo, when he was praying, he was answered by tfilas hamincha. So the kasha is, what's a mincha? Shachris is the main tefillah b'chol yom. Ma'ariv, as you say, Krishma, Shema, but mincha is the tefillah k'tzara in the middle of the day. So the Seder Hayem says, and Chassidus brings it, because Shachris and Ma'ariv are before the work day and the end of the work day. So b'meila, it's not that difficult to daven then. But the middle of the work day, when mincha is davened, it's the middle of the work day, to rip yourself away from your work. Masa matan ba'amuna, that's the hardest thing. So the example for this is one of the examples that Rebbe tells the story, the famous story with, Binyamin Kleskett, I think. making his cheshbenis, right? And he made Tishrei, this is Heitzos and Achnasa, Cheshben, Heitzos and Achnasa, all the different numbers, came to the Sachakel, Eined Milvade. Eined Milvade, or less Asar Ponim, and I think Eined Milvade is the Lashon. So the Rebbe, I remember many times, but I remember once the Rebbe asked the question, he was smiling, and he said, so how did he have the presence to Shrei Ma'aviyad Day numbers? He should have written Tishrei equals Eined Milvade. Cheshvan equals Eined Milvade. Kislev Eined Milvade. Till then he's halting Cheshvan with Tamol Eined Milvade. So the Rebbe again smiled and said, I'm almost sure he said the Lashon, because if he wrote on every day Eined Milvade, then he doesn't belong in business. He belongs in a kelel or in a yeshiva, because it's not tracked to business. The chiddush is that he was a businessman, and he did business with dafzazayin, api masay matane ba'amuna, not gelegen only. And still, even while he's there, Mushke and totally invested in Elam Hazeh, he knows that Sachakel, however, is Eined Milvade. Why am I saying it? Because the chiddush here that he wants to really ultimately establish, and there's Bechal Chassidus, but here Beprotius, I'm just putting it into the more about the Sheisius, is as you'll see, so if you're dealing with Pshittis, it's a hepech of being immersed in Elam Hazeh, or in the tzir of things. If you're in tzir, it seems to be almost impossible to be in a state of Pshittis. And I'm not talking about Haskalah. In Haskalah, everything is shaykh, but in Peil Mamish. So that's why he keeps going back, and you'll see in this Perek Lamed Beis, he says, so on one hand, he says it's Eir in Kalim, so now you have Shetach. You pay Fedish have a structure. But he says, but nevertheless, so he says these words, because if you say that Tzir only comes from Kalim, so then we have the problem the other way around, that when you get to the level of Pshittas Ha'er, you don't really have structure. So that's why, especially in Ayin Beis, he goes according to the Shita that the Eir also has Tzir, because he wants to explain how even the Eir, which is Me'ein HaMoyer, also relates to the structure of existence. So in other words, you don't have to leave Tzir in order to get Pshittas. You could be in a state of Pshittas and also have a connection to Tzir. That's the punchline of it. I'll explain it more in the next shir, but the point is, these stories that I told is really essentially this whole challenge where you're constantly going back and forth. Is the Tzir mitzad the Kalim? Is it mitzad the Eris? So like till now, Atzilus is of course the perfect medium, because Atzilus has Eris and Kalim. Atzilus is like V'tzalti min Aruach. So on one hand, it's not Mesha, on the other, it's still Ruchish al Mesha. So now he's going to discuss it more in the context of Eris and Kalim. Now that the Eris have come into the Kalim, which means the level of Shetach, not the Kudakav. So what's the primary force that creates the Tzir? Is it the Kalim? Or is it also the Eris? The answer is it's also the Eris. That's the punchline in this paragraph. And then the next Maamar, which I thought I'd get to, but okay, everything in its time, is going to now come back and say, okay, once we know what Shetach is, and Eris and Kalim, we now can go and explain how the world was created. Because if you don't have the tools proper, the Eris and Kalim of Shetach, you can't really understand what he's going to talk about, this chalkus of Milo Mata, of Mokim and then Zman. Mokim and Zman, the way we understand Mokim and Zman. So we'll talk about that. It's very fascinating because, we always begin with Mokim and Zman. But the truth is, from the Milo Mata, Zman and Mokim are Nivroim. So there's a point in Seder Shtasus where there is no Zman and Mokim, or Al Kaponim, there's Ruchnis Dik Zman and Mokim, but it doesn't have the structure. Like us, Zman is Ovar, Heva, Osid. Today is not yesterday, and it's not tomorrow. And it's Negein Halacha. Over Zmani Batul Karboni. You can't daven Shachar tomorrow for today. You can't put on film tomorrow for today. So every Zman is very structured, not just Mitzad and Inyan of Gashmi, but also Apteda. And yet, we're going to learn that all this is rooted in places that are not Mugdid in Zman Gashmi. So how do you explain how Ruchni gets into Gashmi? So we have Mamash structure, and you want to make a Dida B'Tachtenim in Zman Mokim Gashmi, and a Dida Leis Baruch, and Leis Baruch is higher than Zman Mokim. So that's why it's so critical to understand what are the Mamutzayim between what is Pshittis and Elikus, and how does it get into a structure, and then how do you join the two? It seems like impossible to join Al Pisech. Again, we're not talking about Tzad Kol Yochel. How do you join something that's completely mugdad in Zman to something that's Lamaylam in Zman? So the gay also to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch about Tikka Chatzos and Madura Basra, where he asks the question, why, how does it work? That everybody says Krishma in their time, and Amshachas are Lamaylam in Zman. So like Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael. If we are working here in New York when it's Shabbos in Eretz Yisrael, that means Amshach of Shabbos is already here on earth. So how is it possible? So what's going on here? That one part of the world is not experiencing that ruchnis. So it's all about how you get from L'mayla Mizman into Zman. We'll discuss it more in the next Shiurim. Okay, stop here. Good.